Hey fellas, how you doing? I decided I'm going to break this video up into two main sections, with an intro and an outro, obviously. The first section is going to be the objective information about the game of Deadlands. The years it came out, the different editions, who created it, all that stuff. The second half of the video is going to be my opinion on the setting, and even some ideas of a Deadlands campaign you could run yourself if you were so inclined. Spoiler alert, I'm a big fan of the setting and the concept of a Weird West setting in general. So, with that out of the way, I hope you guys enjoy. Weird West stories can be anything from alternative history of our real world, to just ghost stories told in the historical Old West, and even completely original settings that just have a Western aesthetic. Mixed, of course, with elements of the supernatural. Typically in the context of telling some kind of horror story, but not always. So if you've ever come across a story of an undead cowboy or a cowboy gunfighting with a vampire or something, that would all be considered Weird West. But at the same time, there could also be random steampunk automatons wandering around too. It's an anything goes kind of genre. If you want a good entry-level movie to get you into the Weird West, the 1973 Clint Eastwood classic High Plains Drifter is a good place to start. It's the kind of movie that starts off as a conventional western. Townspeople beg a drifting gunfighter to save them from coming outlaws seeking revenge, and almost turns into a slasher flick by the end. Since this gunfighter they're begging to save them might not be entirely human. In fact, he might not be entirely there for the townspeople's interest. He might be seeking vengeance against them as well. But I'm not going to spoil that for you. This is a movie well worth watching. There's also Bone Tomahawk if you're looking for a more straightforward horror movie. Just, viewer discretion advised on this one. If you want a quick synopsis, it's basically If the Hills Have Eyes met Tombstone. I think what I'm trying to say here is that the real Weird West are the friends we made along the way.
Shots.
This man right here is Shane Hensley, the creator of Deadlands, and the current owner and president of Pinnacle Entertainment Group, the company that publishes the rules-light generic RPG system, Savage Worlds. Shane and his friends founded Pinnacle Entertainment Group in the year 1994. Their first major project being Fields of Honor, a board game that takes place during the American War for Independence. If I ever meet my sole Patreon supporter Rob in person, I have a feeling we need to play this game against one another, if I could ever track down a copy. The game itself is essentially a hexagon-based tabletop miniature wargame that uses historically accurate weapons. While this game was created in 1994, it appears to have not been released until the year 2000. And I came to this conclusion because on Hensley's wiki page it says he created the board game in 1994, and on the Fields of Honor wiki page it says it wasn't released until the year 2000. And every other source I look up says the game was released in the year 2000, not 1994. But it's also listed as Pinnacle Entertainment's first ever product. So we're just going to say it was their first creation but was held back and released later. Meanwhile, the first edition of Deadlands was published in 1996, going on to win 2 Origin Awards that year. One for Best Role-Playing Game Rules, and one for Best Graphic Presentation of Role-Playing Game Rules. They also released a second edition version of Deadlands that uses basically the same cover, but I couldn't find a good enough picture to use for the video. They were all blurry and I couldn't upscale them enough to fix it. As far as I can tell, this is the version of the game that comes in the 20th Anniversary Edition book, that revised second edition from 1997, which can still be purchased digitally, but appears that the physical copy of the book is now out of print. And I actually own one of these. They're really nice books. I just wouldn't recommend paying the prices I see them going for on the used market. Not in this economy, my friends. Then in the year 2002, during the Open D20 gaming license, a third edition of Deadlands was released using the D20 system of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. The D20 system is somewhat controversial among old-school gamers. It very much simplified the way a lot of games were played, and for games that involve firearms like Deadlands, it sort of makes fights a little more tedious. Also, a lot of D20 games were just really badly made. If there was a licensed RPG of an established property back in this time period, it was almost always a D20 system game, and they were the tabletop role-playing game equivalents of shovelware most of the time. But you can still buy the D20 version of Deadlands off of Pinnacle's website. So at the very least, I have to give Pinnacle props for keeping this available to their fans. The only downside is you can only buy the digital version. The physical versions are all going for actually pretty reasonable prices on the secondhand market. So if the D20 system is something you're more comfortable with and want to give Deadlands a try, there's always this edition. And then around 2005 or 2006, we got Deadlands Reloaded. This version of the game does require the core rulebook for Savage Worlds, the universal roleplay system developed by Pinnacle. You used to be able to buy the Deluxe Explorers edition of the handbook for $9 brand new, but it's looking like those days are long over, and the current edition of the Savage Worlds core rulebook costs around $30 to $40 new. You can get the PDF for $10 from what I see. So, all hail the digital revolution, I guess. Before I move on, let's talk about some spin-offs. We have Deadlands Noir that's set in the 1930s, carrying over the more fantastical and out there elements of the Western game, and bringing it into an urban environment where mystery and schemes are afoot everywhere you look. This game was actually successfully crowdfunded by Pinnacle, and again, I own a physical copy of this book, although at this point it feels like I'm just bragging. Then we have the post-apocalyptic setting Deadlands Hell on Earth, which is in a timeline after the main villains of the series, known as the Reckoners, have achieved their goals, and quite literally turned Earth into hell. You can run a Fallout or Mad Max style game in this setting if you'd like, while adding in the Weird West elements of monsters and Lovecraftian entities invading the world. And then there's Lost Colony, the sci-fi Deadlands game, in which a colony established by the humans of Earth on a foreign planet is now cut off from the homeworld because Hell on Earth happened. So even if you want a space western, you can always give Deadlands a try. It's lasted longer than Starfinder ever did, since the first edition of this was actually published in 2002. There were two spin-off tabletop war games called Rail Wars and Range Wars, both of which won awards but seemed to struggle finding a long-term audience. And lastly, a trading card game called Deadlands Doomtown, which was later rebooted as Boomtown Reloaded. Although the difference between editions seems to be minor. Light rules changes to rebalance the game a little bit. According to the wiki, there have also been 2 cancelled Deadlands computer games. It looks like they were going to be CRPGs or computer RPGs, and a TV show that has been in development hell since the year 2014, and at this point will likely not be released. While I can say it's a shame we never got a proper Deadlands video game, as somebody who's typically not fond of most Hollywood adaptations of his favorite media properties, I'm gonna go ahead and say we're probably better off in the show having never happened. And from this end of the video, I believe I've said all that needs to be said, and from here on out, we'll be moving into the lore of the Deadlands setting. Like all tabletop RPGs, you could easily just gut the rule system and make your own setting if you wanted to. But honestly, I'm a big fan of the Deadlands setting as it is, and I'd like to explore the lore for you if you guys would like to continue sticking around. Alright, so for the most part, the lore of Deadlands is pretty straightforward. It's an alternative timeline version of late 1800s America. The exact time period of the setting has changed with various editions, but it normally takes place in the 1880s. The Civil War has ground to a stalemate because of strange interventions from the western frontier. A rogue Native American shaman called Raven, formerly of the Sioux, made a pact with otherworldly entities known only as the Reckoners. What exactly the Reckoners are is kind of left up to the game master's interpretation, but for the most part they're Lovecraftian elder gods beyond form or thought. Raven and his coven of shamans, known as the Last Sons, performed a ritual which brought the Deadlands to Earth, halting the western expansion of the United States, and as previously mentioned, grinding the American Civil War to a standstill. So, in the Deadlands universe, America is essentially divided like the Korean Peninsula is in modern times. This ritual also essentially shattered the barrier between the natural and the supernatural in this world, making magic far easier to obtain by the average person, causing this substance known as ghost rock to appear in the West. It's essentially coal that can generate the power of a small nuclear reactor when burned. It contains the souls of the damned and wails as the fire consumes it. It's an incredibly valuable resource people are willing to waste human lives over. Its power yield allowing for otherwise impossible inventions to become reality in this world, like steam-powered automatons, and even guns that shoot lightning. Vampires, Wendigo, Cthulhu death cults, all of these and much more can all exist in the Deadlands setting, all of which are in some way influenced by the otherworldly Reckoners, a force that is canonically unstoppable and always wins in the end, giving this setting a feeling of melancholy, and leaving the party to face the fact that they are confronting the inevitable, and whether or not they want to continue standing against these dark forces or attempt to join them. So you can literally run your campaign as a Wild West-themed berserk or Nietzschean fanfiction if you want to. And then there's Stone. While Raven may be the prophet of the Reckoners, Stone is their hand, their will made manifest. The nuclear option of the game master who feels their party has gone out of control or too powerful. While he can be put down temporarily, he will always return, and he will hunt down his enemies to the ends of the earth. He was once a man known as Jasper Stone, a captain of the Confederate States of America's army. Now he serves a new master, a higher order of master in the form of the Reckoners. He is the one who canonically brings about the setting of hell on earth, by traveling backwards in time and eliminating all potential threats before they could ever rise up against the Reckoners in the first place. As long as the Deadlands exist, so does Stone. Yet the player characters are far from defenseless, as aside from your more standard gunslingers, they can also be the blessed. Holy warriors blessed by angels and possibly even God himself to fight back against the Reckoners. And wizards who cast their spells via cards called hucksters, who essentially engage in gambling games with the spirits in order to gain their magical abilities. It's all based around poker rules, so how good the hand is depends on how powerful the spell effect is, or whether or not the spell backfires depending on the version. There's voodoo priests if you want to play this world's equivalent of a necromancer, and Native American shamans who sort of take the role of druids in this setting, since most of the Native American tribes were against summoning the Reckoners, knowing that it would inevitably cause the end of the world, meaning Raven's ritual was completely forbidden by shamanistic practices. You can even play as a walking corpse known as the Harrowed. They are essentially revenants with unfinished business left on Earth, so a player character could essentially be a weaker version of Stone if they so choose. And some editions of Deadlands also allow you to play as foreigners, like martial arts masters from the East, Victorian-era gangsters, disgraced samurai from Japan. All of that stuff sometimes we forget overlapped in real-world history in the late 1800s. It's all on the table here in Deadlands. Of course, if you're like me, you'd probably make a more normal human character, a Texas Ranger or a county sheriff, a Pinkerton or a private detective, a farm boy who got a little over his head, a soldier who's gone AWOL, something like that. You can do pretty much whatever you want to do here in Deadlands. That's half the fun of it.
So you're the one that the boss keeps talking about. And you? Special Operations Foxhound. Revolver. Ocelot.
Alright, so the reason I keep showing Revolver Ocelot in this video, or Ocelot as he's called in Metal Gear Solid 3, is because he's a good example of what a character archetype in the Deadlands setting can be, whether he's used as an NPC or a player character. A double-crossing, secret agent gunslinger type, constantly showing off his dexterity and hand-eye coordination by juggling or spinning his revolvers, where it really walks that line between being completely cartoony and over-the-top and kinda badass. And even if you're trying to run a more grounded version of Deadlands in your tabletop, and even if you're going for a more grounded, gritty, Weird West story for whatever reason, throwing in a random over-the-top character like this every once in a while can still be a good tension breaker every now and then. I don't know. Ultimately, if you're going to run a Deadlands game, you're going to run it your way, and it's between you and your group what you want to do with it. But here's a few ideas for Deadlands campaigns you could run with on your own if you want to. You can modify them, do whatever you want, I don't care. You can start the story off in a Wild Bunch situation, a botched bank robbery that turns into a bloodbath, where the players have to fight their way out of town and end up with law enforcement hot on their heels. Maybe they were mind-controlled into doing the robbery, and the whole point of the campaign is about solving the mystery of who was controlling them. Or maybe the party are all just a bunch of criminals on the run now, with no one to turn to but each other. If there was ever a setting where an evil campaign would be the easiest to do, it's Deadlands, since Wild West stories are full of outlaw gang legends. You know, the James gang, the Clanton gang, all that. Or maybe you want to go the more classic white hat route and have a Magnificent Seven situation, where the party and maybe a few NPCs are hired on by a town to protect it from hordes of the undead, where the final boss can be good old Dracula with a revolver. Although judging from the cover of this pre-written adventure module you can buy, that might actually be a canon story. So, you know, that's always fun. And if you're running Deadlands Reloaded, you can just throw in monsters included in the Savage Worlds core rulebook, like orcs and goblins and dragons if you really want. I'm not gonna call the cops on you, I promise. Who am I to stop you from turning your fistful of dollars story into Land of the Lost, or Where the Wild Things Are, or whatever you crazy rascals can think up in your weird little heads. I say have fun with that, and I'll only judge you behind your back. Alright fellas, we laughed a little, we cried a little, Kevin even peed his pants. But I've said just about all I can say about the topic. Deadlands is probably my favorite tabletop RPG system and setting out there, and I genuinely hate the fact that every time I join an RPG group, all they ever want to play is D&D, and the idea of even trying a new setting is almost like pulling teeth with some people. I really hate it. And as a collector and enthusiast of antique revolvers, I can show off my useless niche knowledge nobody but me actually cares about. But I guess that's just my own vanity talking. Anyway, thank you guys for sticking around and watching this whole mess of a video. You guys have a good one, you hear? Or else.